Hey guys, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Anchor. Now that it's my second year of podcasting, I thought you all should know that I've only used Anchor to record all of my podcasts. And if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's simply the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There are so many creative creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your own cell phone and your own computer. Anchor then does the hardest part for you. They go ahead and distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so many other platforms. Now, I think it's everything you need to make your own podcast in one place. So what are you guys waiting for? Go ahead and download the free Anchor app today and head on over to anchor.fm to get started. Have fun. Hey everyone, welcome back to all my listeners. Now I hope you're all having a great day so far, because I know I am. Now, as I'm recording this episode, this last week of March, I know I'm exhausted, exhausted, watching my late night 10 p.m. starts to those Sweet 16 March Madness basketball games. And here we go on to the Elite Eight. And you know what, exhausted or not, I've got coffee in my hands and just enjoying my March Madness. I can't believe it's almost over. It's wrapping up really, really quickly. But again, I've enjoyed all of my games. I love them all. Anyway, now, if it's your first time finding me, thanks so much, you guys, and welcome. Welcome to episode 13 of my 5th season. Today is Wednesday, March 30th, 2022. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. Now, all right, you guys, I've got so much to get into today. Again, it's the last episode this month of March. So I'm going to be diving into my compliance tips and my compliance recommendations today on the new hot off the press CBR just being mailed out for Lipid Panel Testing. And hey, you all know it's my favorite month-end episode where I discuss highlights from the month of March's criminal and civil enforcement cases involving fraud, waste, and abuse. And I go ahead and round out today's episode with a remarkable quote on clarity and focus from American filmmaker Ava DuVernay. If you've checked me out on LinkedIn, you know I'm all about compliance and protecting our physicians and valued healthcare professionals when it comes to the business of medicine. I hope this week with me brings you enough to take back to your organizations, to want to dive in deeper, to use my tips and best practices to ensure success. I hope this podcast will help all of you boost the quality of documentation capture and improve your coding accuracy as you help your providers paint the medical picture. If you like what you're hearing, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss another episode. Please write in a review and kindly drop me a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to my podcast. I'd really love your support. And as always, a friendly disclaimer. Remember, I'm bringing you the news, current healthcare industry news, my compliance tips and recommendations based on my over 10 years of experience in front office, in back end, in coding, and in billing for multi-specialty physicians, compliance, and in auditing for both E&M and surgical operative reports. These are my opinions alone and are not to be construed as legal advice. So let's get into Newsworthy, the month's fraud, waste, and abuse cases. The month of March saw a whopping 46 cases as of the recording of this episode. Early March saw a case where 2 Florida men were charged with an alleged $11 million Medicare fraud scheme to traffic in prescriptions for medical equipment. Now, these 2 men allegedly ran companies dedicated to illegally buying and selling prescriptions for durable medical equipment. That's our DME, such as leg, arm and back braces, and then using those prescriptions to file fraudulent Medicare claims for more than $11 million, as well as selling these prescriptions to other DME supply companies so that those companies in turn could also file fraudulent Medicare claims. Now, as stated in the indictment, allegedly from at least July 2019 through at least October of 2020, these two men engaged in a scheme to defraud Medicare in at least 3 different ways. First, they allegedly paid kickbacks of more than $565,000 to purchase fraudulent DME prescriptions, including prescriptions signed by doctors who never, in fact, signed or authorized those prescriptions at all. And those doctors were unaware that their names and their identities were, in fact, being used in such a way. Now, and these particular DME prescriptions were for such equipment like braces for ankles, knees, elbows, wrists, and backs. Now, second, this pair also unlawfully received more than $425,000 in kickbacks, reselling some of these prescriptions to DME suppliers so that those other suppliers could then in turn fraudulently bill Medicare for the DME supplies. And finally, third, around May and June of 2020, both men acquired 5 of their own fraudulent DME supply companies and used the bogus prescriptions to file more than $11 million in fraudulent Medicare claims, seeking payment to the DME suppliers that they both controlled. Now, early March also saw a case involving a university. Now, this university agreed to pay $899,824.55 to settle a voluntary disclosure related to the university's psychological clinic. Here, the university has again agreed to pay that roughly $899,000 to resolve allegations of civil liability for the submission of claims by the university's psychological clinic to Medicare, TRICARE, and Medicaid between February 1st, 2015 and July 31st of 2020 for services involved with behavioral health, as well as evaluation and management services that violated Medicare rules and Medicare regulations. Now, according to the U.S. attorney on the case, the university through the clinic is alleged to have submitted improper claims related to behavioral health services with respect to the supervision of doctoral students, incident to billing requirements, and or the credentialing of licensed practitioners for Medicare participation. Additionally, the clinic is alleged to have submitted claims for evaluation and management services that were not supported by the medical record. After discovering these problems, the university took prompt corrective actions and disclosed the matter to the United States Attorney's Office. Now, in mid-March, there's a case of an eye practice and its owners who entered into a civil settlement agreement with the federal and state governments to resolve allegations that they, in fact, improperly employed an individual who was excluded from all federal health care programs. This employee was with the eye practice between February of 2010 and May of 2021. Now, this employee had previously been convicted of health care fraud. Of course, as a result of this conviction, this individual was then excluded from all federal health care programs. Now, when the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of the Inspector General, that's our HHS OIG, excludes an individual or an entity from federal healthcare programs, no program payments may be made for items or services furnished by that excluded individual or entity. So it's good to note that back in September of 1999, the HHS OIG issued a special advisory bulletin in order to provide guidance to healthcare providers who might employ or contract with an excluded individual or entity. Also in May of 2013, the HHS OIG issued an updated special advisor bulletin containing additional guidance. Both the original and updated special advisory bulletins advised that in order to avoid potential liability, healthcare providers should always check the list of excluded individuals or the list of excluded entities on the HHS OIG website. And you can always find that located at http://oig.hhs.gov/exclusions. Now, March end saw another case involving an addiction treatment facility's medical director who was convicted in an alleged $112 million addiction treatment fraud scheme. Now, in this particular case, the medical director of 2 South Florida addiction treatment facilities worked with others to unlawfully bill for approximately $112 million of addiction treatment services that were never rendered or they were never medically necessary at 2 of those addiction treatment facilities. Now, the facilities included an inpatient detox and residential facility, as well as a related outpatient treatment program. Now, the evidence allegedly showed that the medical director and the others admitted patients for medically unnecessary detox services, which are the most expensive kind of treatment that the facilities offered. Now, patient recruiters offered kickbacks to induce patients to attend the programs and then gave them illegal drugs to ensure admittance. Evidence at trial also showed that the medical director submitted false and fraudulent claims for excessive, medically unnecessary urinalysis drug tests that were never used in treatment. The medical director and the others then authorized the readmission of a core group of patients who were then shuffled between both the inpatient and the outpatient locations to fraudulently bill for as much as possible, even though the patients did not need the expensive treatment for which they were repeatedly admitted. Patients were prescribed with a so-called comfort drink to sedate them, ensure they stayed at the facilities, and keep them coming back. And the evidence further showed that the medical director's login was used with his knowledge by others to sign electronic medical files to make it appear as if he had provided the treatment himself, when, of course, he did not. And, of course, there's always the many, many usual suspects, right, in all of my month-end episodes. Like there were more cases involved with opioids distributors, overprescribing, kickbacks, bribery schemes, fraudulent DME billings, and money laundering. But I wanted to pay particular attention to a case I find most sad, most disturbing, most mind-blowing. Here, there was a case involving 12 physicians sentenced to prison for distributing 6.6 million opioid pills and submitting $250 million in false billings. Now, in this healthcare fraud scheme, it included the exploitation of patients suffering from addiction and the illegal distribution of over 6.6 million doses of medically unnecessary opioids. Now, to date, there are 5 physicians who were convicted in 2 separate trials, while 18 other defendants pleaded guilty. 7 of those defendants are still awaiting sentencing. Now, according to court documents and evidence presented at trial, the scheme allegedly involved doctors refusing to provide patients with opioids unless they agreed to unnecessary back injections. All of this allegedly went through a multi-state network of pain clinics from the years 2007 to 2018. The evidence established that the clinics were pill mills frequented by patients suffering from addiction, as well as drug dealers who sought to obtain high-dosage prescription drugs like oxycodone. The doctors working at the clinics agreed to work only a few hours a week to, quote, stay under the radar, end quote, of the Drug Enforcement Administration. That's our DEA. Yet they were among the highest prescribers of oxycodone in the state of Michigan. Now, to obtain prescriptions, the evidence also showed that the patients had to submit expensive had to submit 2 expensive, unnecessary, and sometimes very painful back injections known as Facet joint injections. Now, the injections were selected because they are one of the highest reimbursing procedures rather than based on medical need. Trial testimony established that in some instances, patients experienced more pain from those injections than from the pain they had purportedly come in to have treated, and that some patients developed adverse conditions, including open holes in their backs. Patients largely acquiesced, they yielded to these unnecessary procedures because of their addiction or their desire to obtain pills to be resold on the streets by drug dealers. Evidence further established that the defendant physicians repeatedly performed these unnecessary injections on patients over several years and were paid more for facet joint injections than any other medical clinic in the United States. The evidence further established that the proceeds of the fraud were used to fuel lavish lifestyles. One physician bought jewelry, cars, and vacations, as well as paid Ultimate Fighting Championships and other mixed martial arts fighters to promote his specialized diet program. Another part owner purchased private jet flights, courtside tickets to the NBA Finals, and expensive real estate. Other physicians involved in the scheme purchased luxury cars, gold bars, and indoor basketball courts and swimming pools. Over $16 million in fraud proceeds was forfeited by the United States from the defendants. All right. Wow. Oh my goodness, right? So the month of March was clearly chock full of fraud, waste, and abuse cases once again. And I'm sure there's still a few more days to the end of this month as I'm recording. So I'm sure there's still another handful that have been tacked on for my original total I disclosed of 46. Now, remember that facet joint injection procedures are known to be on the OIG hit list, the latest one as of December 2021. Now, remember, I've also discussed these same injections in my Trusty Tips compliance recommendations way back in season 1. So you can always go back and play that podcast because that information is still current to this day. Now, I do my very best each month trying to highlight those cases I find most interesting. I try my best to provide solid guidance and advice to providers to be mindful of correct coding and compliant billing practices to avoid joining these very serious, these very public, and often very hefty outcomes. I always believe these types of fraud, waste, and abuse cases are most helpful. They are my favorite. So please take a deeper look into these reports and see how they may affect you, your provider, your facility. Start self-auditing your service claims and coordinating documentation to ensure you are meeting compliance. And now it's time for my best practice tips in Trusty Tip. So in today's compliance tip, I wanted to focus on the latest comparative billing report, or CBR, that's been issued on lipid panel testing. It's CBR number 202203. That's right, it's the third CBR for the new year for 2022. Now, right now, during the end of March, CMS is going to be issuing this comparative billing report on Medicare Part B claims for lipid panel testing. Now, this CBR 202203 focuses on providers listed as referring providers on Medicare Part B claims for lipid panel testing, cholesterol testing, and direct low-density lipoprotein, or LDL, cholesterol testing using CPT codes 80061, 82465, and 83721, respectively. Now, for the purposes of this particular CBR document and its analysis, these 3 CPT codes will be referred to as lipid panel testing. Now, that's the direct language coming off of this particular CBR. Now, additionally, the letter states that the CPT code 80061 will be referred to as lipid panel, and CPT code 82465 will be referred to as total cholesterol, and the CPT code 83721 will be referred to as LDL cholesterol test. So be mindful of that language if you happen to receive that lipid panel testing CBR letter that comes to you. Now, the letter also reminds us to use this data-driven report to compare your billing practices with those of your peers in your state and across the nation. Now, again, those CPT codes that they're instructing us to be mindful of is for 80061 for lipid panel, 82465 for cholesterol, serum, or whole blood total, and finally, the CPT code 83721, which is defined as lipoprotein direct measurement LDL cholesterol. Now, the CBR 202203 analyzes the following things. First of all, those referring providers on Medicare Part B claims for lipid panel testing, cholesterol testing, and direct low-density lipoprotein, that's our LDL cholesterol testing. And then second, the CBR 202203 will be analyzing the submission of claims by providers for those CPT codes for lipid panel testing, which includes, again, those same three, 80061, 82465, and 83721. Now, the overarching rationale, right? This is what's important. This is what's driving this particular CBR. So the overarching rationale behind CBR 202203 is that, number one, according to the 2021 Medicare Fee-for-Service Supplemental Improper Payment Data Report, there is 23.7% of improper payment rate for clinical laboratories, and that represents over $907 million in improper payments. That's a big number. And then second, the second rationale is that 90% of this improper payment rate is attributed to insufficient documentation. That's such a large number, you guys. 90% of that improper payment rate is for insufficient documentation. And then third, the rationale is that 8% of the improper payment rate is attributed to incorrect coding. So it's more of an issue on insufficient documentation than on incorrect coding. But as we hone in further, the criteria for receiving the CBR 202203 involves three things. First, if that provider is significantly higher compared to either state or national percentages in any of the four metric calculations, which means greater than or equal to the 90th percentile, right? And then the second criteria is that the provider has had at least 200 total beneficiaries with claims that have been submitted for CPT codes 80061, 82465, and 83721. And finally, third criteria for receiving it is if that provider has had at least $5,300 in total allowed charges for lipid panel testing. Now, the metrics of this CBR 202203 has 4 items in the metrics, right? So it's an analysis that contains these following 4. Number 1, the percent of lipid panels with direct LDL cholesterol test on the same day. Number 2, the percent of beneficiaries receiving greater than 1 lipid panel in a rolling year. Number 3, the percent of beneficiaries receiving greater than 3 LDL cholesterol tests in a rolling year. And then finally, fourth, the percent of beneficiaries receiving greater than 3 total cholesterol tests in a rolling year. So let's break it down even further, okay? So for the percent of lipid panels with direct LDL cholesterol test on the same day. So the calculation of that metric number 1. It's calculated as the number of claims for a lipid panel. Again, that's with our CPT code 80061, which was billed with an LDL cholesterol test that's our CPT code 83721, on the same date of service for the same beneficiary, that number is going to be divided by the number of claims for a lipid panel. And again, that's our CPT code 80061, which was billed with an LDL cholesterol test. That's an 83721 CPT code within 30 days for the same beneficiary. So that's how they calculated that metric number one. Now, for metric number two, for the percent of beneficiaries receiving greater than one lipid panel in a rolling year, how they calculate that. It's the total number of beneficiaries with greater than one date of service with a claim for a lipid panel. Again, that's our 80061 within a rolling year. That's going to be divided by the number of beneficiaries with at least one claim for a lipid panel. That's our CPT code 80061. And then the third metric, right? That percent of beneficiaries receiving greater than 3 LDL cholesterol tests in a rolling year. How they calculate metric 3 is from the number of beneficiaries with greater than 3 dates of service with a claim, again with that LDL cholesterol test with our CPT code 83721 within a rolling year. That's going to be divided by the number of beneficiaries with at least one claim for an LDL cholesterol test with CPT code 83721. Now, and finally, fourth, that last metric for percent of beneficiaries receiving greater than 3 total cholesterol tests in a rolling year. The way they calculate metric 4 is with the number of beneficiaries with greater than 3 dates of service with a claim with a lipid panel in our 80061 or a total cholesterol test in our CPT code 82465 within a rolling year. That is going to be divided by the number of beneficiaries with at least one claim with a lipid panel with CPT code 80061 or a total cholesterol test with our CPT code 82465. Now, all of those metrics are going to be listed on your CBR. It's critical to understand that a CBR does not indicate that you're going to get an official audit, right? Although please be mindful, and I've said this on podcast after podcast where I disclose those CBRs. This particular phrase, it is coming directly from the MACs that issue the CBRs. So take that with plenty of grains of salt. More directly, consider this to be your notice. It's your warning that you are in fact being looked at very closely. The value of the CBR to providers is that it does serve as a tool to look at their billing patterns as compared to their peers. The value also includes the facts that specific coding guidelines and billing information will be detailed, and I just disclosed all of them for you here. The CBR informs providers whose billing patterns differ from those of their peers. Once again, that's a point I want to keep striving. You have to look at the data. Now, the desired behavior here, obviously, is to capture proper and compliant documentation for lipid panel testing, right? So it's important to keep in mind that there's been a study from the Office of the Inspector General, the OIG, which was released in May of 2021, that noted that, quote, payments made to providers for direct LDL tests that were billed in addition to lipid panels did not comply with Medicare requirements. Under certain circumstances, it may be medically necessary for a provider to perform both tests for the same beneficiary on the same date of service. However, CMS and Medicare contractors explained that these circumstances should happen with only limited frequency. We determined that some providers billed LDL tests in addition to lipid panels for the same beneficiary on the same date of service more than 75% of the time. We refer to such providers as at-risk providers, end quote. So that's incredibly important, that OIG report from way back in May of 2021. That's important to keep in mind, right? So in this instance, I hope it's clear that providers are performing their internal auditing on lipid panel testing services. It's fundamental, if you have Medicare as a payer, to keep your eye on correct and compliant coding and billing practices and make sure you are adhering to all of them. It's vital to capture full and robust documentation to ensure you are meeting the medical necessity from the very start. So start by tracking your lipid panel testing services. Are you paying attention to the frequency of which you bill for both LDL tests and lipid panel tests on the same date of service for the same patient? Are you documenting the medical necessity, following LCD guidelines on utilization? Remember, Novitas has an active LCD or local coverage determination and addresses lipids for frequency. They say that no more than every 2 months for any test. Tests like for your triglycerides, your LDL cholesterol levels, whether they're in a panel or separately ordered. So no more than every 2 months for any of those types of tests. And then they also list an acceptable reason for going over those limitations. They give examples like for the inability to stabilize lipid-lowering drug dosing, or if there's an adverse reaction to lipid-lowering drugs, or if there happens to be pancreatitis involved, or if you're monitoring for acitretin therapies. So it's important to make sure that the clinical documentation addresses and captures all indications for coverage, and you avoid the whopping 90% rate of insufficient documentation attributable to this CBR on lipid panel testing. So a better, smarter approach is one that's proactive and starts by painting a clear, rich, and vibrant medical picture the first time, so your certified medical coder can then abstract codes with accuracy. And finally, I focus Season 5 Spark on clarity and focus. I want this 5th season Spark to be filled with the world's thought leaders, writers, artists, philosophers, everyone who inspires the need for clarity and focus in all that we do. So, in this week's inspiring quote in Spark is from American female filmmaker Ava DuVernay. Ignore the glass ceiling and do your work. If you're focusing on the glass ceiling, focusing on what you don't have, focusing on the limitations, then you will be limited. So very true, right? I think this is an amazing quote that reminds us, inspires us, that our focus should never remain on limitations. Instead, this quote reminds us that we alone have the power to change our focus, change our mindset each and every day to hard work and persistence to get the results we strive for. I am happy Ava DuVernay's spark still burns brightly in all of us today. So that wraps up today's episode. And as always, I appreciate you all diving into today with me. If you want more information from me, please go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn. I'll leave links to everything in the show notes below. Please have an amazing week ahead, and please continue staying safe and healthy. Thank you so much for listening in on today's episode, and I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.